you grew up in a polygamous setting. What was that like?
Yes, a lot of people might not fully understand what that is because it's a different kind of marriage. But I think those things they prepare me for life to be able to handle conflict, to be able to understand struggle.
So, what is your view on a man with multiple wives in today's age?
There's a lot of questions around identity. The other is this understanding around sexuality. I think sexuality is linked to identity. So it's no surprise that polyamory and all these other alternatives are out there at the moment.
And that has always baffled me, right? There seems to be a circle that is happening here. Was it a shock for you?
For many of us who came to the UK, there is always that expectation that Britain is a Christian country. But as you come into the country, you realize that that is no longer the case. I remember going back to Nigeria, going back to my church, Pentecostal church, and telling someone that there's a lot of people that don't believe in God in the UK. And this lady was just so shocked and said, how can people survive without believing in God? I'm like, well, a lot of people do actually. You have to rethink how you do evangelism. You have to rethink how you do church.
A statement that you said to me, which was how difficult it is for a black man or a black pastor to lead a multicultural church.
It's easier for a white pastor to lead an intercultural church than a black pastor. And the reason for that is because white leadership is generally accepted than leadership of a person of color, because I think their leadership is still on trial, is still on probation.
Welcome to another Soul episode, and today's guest is Dr. Israel Olofinjana. He was born into a polygamous family where faith, culture, and complexity intersected. His spiritual journey began in an African Indigenous church tradition, but as he grew older in his teenage years, he encountered Pentecostal Christianity, and that was a decision that would change the course of his life. From navigating the challenges of migration as a missionary migrant in the UK to pioneering intellectual and spiritual movement across continents, Dr. Israel's story is one of courage, cross cultural navigation, and deep theological insight. He is a writer, a thought leader, and pioneer of the Center for Missionaries from the Majority World, which is CMMW, a movement that is looking to reverse the traditional flow of mission and power. Aside from that, he is also a husband, a theologian, and a man passionate about global issues. So it is with great privilege to say welcome, Dr. Israel.
Thank you very much, Victor. A pleasure to be here to have this conversation.
Awesome, great to have you. I came across some of your work, and they are deeply fascinating. And I think a lot of times people see the work, but they don't know who is behind that work. And what we would look to do today in this conversation is to understand you, understand your upbringing, understand your lived wisdom, your experiences, and see how we can learn from that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so should we start from the fact that you grew up in a polygamous setting? What was that like, and what were the challenges, or perhaps the great things about growing up in that setting?
Yes. So I think a lot of people might not fully understand what that is because it's a different kind of marriage. It's a marriage where a man has more than one wife. And my father happens to have two wives. And even my whole mom's family and dad's family, I have uncles and both sides who marry more than one wife. So it's a kind of a system that I grew up in and understand. Um, I think I must say from the start that, because this is very important, that my dad wasn't a bad father. He was a good father and he looked after us. But obviously, when you have more than one wife, you get distracted. You are catering almost for two families in that sense. So I grew up with this notion of, yes, dad was great, but he wasn't always around in that sense because he lived in a different city from where I grew up in that sense. So he will come in like once in a while to see us, that kind of stuff. So I grew up with that kind of understanding of family. So I see some of my other friends' dads around more than my own dad in that sense. So I grew up with that kind of a notion of an extended polygamous family. And I suppose because growing up in Nigeria back then, sense of family was very strong. And so other people's family look after me, and of course my mom and siblings and all that kind of stuff. So I was looked after by my own family, my own mom and siblings, but also by other parents. Because I think the notion was that the way you raise a child in that Nigerian context was that everybody's helping you to help to raise up that child. So other parents, other moms, other dads, they were helping in that sense. So that was the sort of impact on me to see family from a different perspective. So my understanding of family is not a nuclear family unit; it's more of an extended, large family. In that sense, of course, there were tensions because obviously, when you have more than one wife, there will always be tensions. So yeah, there was tension, there were struggles in that sense. But I think those things they prepare me for life. They prepare me for uh, for where I am today, to be able to handle conflict, to be able to understand struggle, to be able to understand those kind of things. So I think they make you tougher in a different way in that sense. So, well, as I started, my father wasn't a bad person. He just happens to be uh, someone who followed the system, which was that many men back then had many wives. I think a lot of people still do today on the continent, having more than one wife.
Yeah, and what is your thought on that now? I know it was a cultural norm back in those days, and like even my dad's dad had multiple wives, and my mom's dad, and I know many people, and a lot of times these are people that are Christians as well, or proclaim to be Christians. So, what is your view on a man with multiple wives in today's age, or not even today's age,
Sure.
ever, right?
Yeah, I will not encourage it. Definitely one man, one woman. I think it's my would be my advice. I haven't had that experience. And I even remember my dad. I think he regretted it because I remember a few times he would say to me that if he were to do it all over again, it would definitely be one woman in that sense. So, and I think when we look at it from a biblical perspective as well, what Jesus advocated for was one man, one woman, and what we see in biblical perspective. Although, having said that, the Old Testament has lots of examples of men with multiple wives, because again, part of the culture back then is that you worship different gods, you marry more women. It was kind of like something that goes together in the culture that they were in. But definitely, I think marriages definitely should be for one man, one woman. I think the extras, whatever and again, this is why it's very important. One of the ways the Western world think about this today, the Western world doesn't embrace polygamy, but embraces polyamory and other alternatives in marriage. And I say to people that Africans have come a long way to reject polygamy, and any Western form that is not monogamy, Africans will reject it, because if they want an alternative in marriage, they would definitely offer polygamy. But if an African Christian have rejected that, then polyamory or all these other forms of modern marriage that we talk in the Western context, they reject that as well, because they've come far from rejecting their own African alternatives to monogamy in that sense.
Why do you think the Western um, are now they've rejected polygamy, and all of a sudden polyamory is now something that they are slowly accepting? Why do you think there's this switch in the Western culture?
I think several things are going on. One is there's a lot of questions around identity. And I think identity is a very powerful thing in the Western. We all searching. Identity is something important to all of us, whether you are Western or African in that sense. So I think that's one driving point. The other is this understanding around sexuality. I think sexuality is linked to identity now, whereas before I think perhaps we separated it, but now it's so linked. Sexuality, people would describe themselves in different ways. Hence, we talk about other forms of alternatives of relationships and so on. So I think identity driving sexual identity is a primer that I think shapes how we people are responding. But also I think there is as part of that search for identity and meaning and true sexuality, I think we are revisiting in the Western world New Age practices. We are going back to the New Age thinking where some of these other forms of relationships are accepted or part of the religious traditions in the past. So there is a resurgence of some of that, a resurgence of spirituality that speaks to identity, that speaks to sexuality, that speaks to all those things. And people are searching through all those means. So it's no surprise that polyamory and all these other alternatives are out there at the moment. But I always still find it interesting that despite the fact that those alternatives are there, people in the Western world have still not warmed up properly to polygamy. So I still find it very interesting in that sense. But I suspect, give it time. Again, that might change. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, you never know because everything is changing quite rapidly, and I do agree that it is all about identity. I think not just in identity in terms of sexual identity, but also identity in terms of spiritual beliefs, identity in terms of cultural identity. I think to me that is what the whole immigration talk about now is about identity. Are we losing our identity
Yeah,
as a nation? Are we losing our culture as a nation because of all these things? And there's so many things that you can talk about, but it wasn't until, if I'm being honest, it's not until recently that I realized how powerful identity is. I think as a young person growing up, for me, it has always been a talk of, economy. Does it make economical sense? And it's all about money, money, money at some point.
yeah,
In the last few years, it's all about it's always been about money and the material things. And now there's a shift into identity. And that is the big talk today about what is your identity in terms of culture? What is your identity in terms of race?
yeah,
What is your identity in terms of sex? Identity in terms of religion? Identity in terms of spiritual thought? So I think that is extremely timely, and that is things that the younger people are looking for answers for.
mm,
We all want to know who we are, and I know that you grew up in an African Indigenous church religion
yeah.
setting. Maybe, and then you encountered at the age of 17, Pentecostalism and all that. Do you want to tell us,
Sure,
you know,
sure.
what was it that you were doing and why the switch?
Yeah, so I attended church with my mom, and my mom worshipped in a church that would be described as an African Indigenous church. My mom worshipped in a cherubim and seraphim church, which I know many Nigerian Pentecostals will frown upon and be like, should we even be calling those churches? So my mom grew up in those kind of churches, uh, churches that some people will call white garment churches. So, and you don't argue with your Nigerian mom that you're not going to go to church. It's compulsory. You don't argue. So, went to church with mom, and I think I went to church for the first 17 years of my life with my mom, and so Christianity wasn't necessarily mine the way I saw it. It was like I go to church because of mom, go to Sunday school. In fact, I didn't like Sunday school, to be honest. I dreaded Sunday school. So I wasn't very connected at Sunday school back in the church. But I think later I appreciated those kind of churches, African Indigenous churches, because I think a lot of people look down on them. But what many people don't realize is that the history of the African Indigenous churches on the continent is actually quite powerful, because these are the group of churches that reacted against colonial Christianity, the Christianity that wanted Africans to dress like Europeans, that wanted Africans to speak like Europeans. Many of these African indigenous churches indigenized Christianity, hence they took their name, African Independent Church, because they were independent of Western mission churches. And then later they were called indigenous because they were indigenizing Christianity among people. So by the use of African languages. So in the case of Nigeria, many of these churches will use Yoruba or Igbo or any of the other Nigerian languages. They will not use English because they were appealing to the local people. Also, they will use African drums. They will use African clothing. The preachers will preach in African languages. So in my own church, the preachers will speak in Yoruba. Whereas if you go to the newer Pentecostal churches, many of the preachers will speak in English, even though they're in Nigeria or they might be in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, will still be preaching in English. Whereas African indigenous churches will be speaking authentic African languages to people in that sense. So I think those churches are quite powerful. I didn't realize that when I was going to those churches. It was later that I realized that. So at the age of 17, I had a bit of a crisis, and it was in a form of leaving school, basically, leaving secondary school. Because I failed my exams, and as you probably know, in the context of Nigeria, if you fail, you repeat the same. Yeah, so it was very disgraceful. I didn't feel like I wanted to repeat being in the same year with juniors coming into my year, that kind of stuff. So I left school basically. I wasn't even sure whether I was going to continue education at that time. I had a kind of a mini crisis that I just felt this is not what I wanted to do. I'm not sure whether I even wanted to continue education. I was looking for other alternatives, but started going to extra, like what you would call lessons, extra educational schooling outside of school itself to prepare for my GCE and exams and stuff like that to get into university. But around that time, I was isolated from my friends. So I started going to a Pentecostal church, not far from me back then. And there, at the watch night service, became a Christian, dedicated my life to Christ. At this watch night service again, which is something that is very keen, something a spiritual practice among African churches, watch night services into the new year as you cross over into the new year. So I was in one of those services in Nigeria, in Ibadan, and then became, I didn't, well, the altar call was made, but I didn't go out. I said the prayers in my heart, and then something changed from then on. So I started attending a newer Pentecostal church in that sense. So I think looking back, I'm so glad that I had the experience of the African Indigenous Church and the African Newer Pentecostal Church in Nigeria, because I think those experiences of two churches, they inform some of the things that I'm doing today, speaking into Pentecostal circles, but also bringing a sense of indigenous theology to some of the things that I'm doing. So very key in shaping my experience.
Fantastic. And one thing that I was thinking about is, at the end of the day, Christianity is all about following Christ and Christ being the center of it. Are there real doctrinal differences between the African indigenous churches and what we call Pentecostal? Because what it seems to me is to be quite superficial in terms of maybe the dressing, the way you dress, and although I'm not ignoring the fact that it is super important, to communities in terms of identity, but in terms of the religion itself or what Christianity aims to profess, which is more of a deep value of human integrity, human value, loving God, loving people. Um, are there real doctrinal differences?
Um,
You know,
yes, there were doctrinal emphasis. So the newer Pentecostal church, I said that there was an emphasis on the gifts of the Holy Spirit in a different way, more around speaking in tongues and those kind of things, the use of the gifts of the Spirit. Whereas in the Aladora church, there was the gifts of the Spirit, but it wasn't an emphasis the way the newer Pentecostal churches put an emphasis on it in that sense. There was definitely spiritual gift, but it was more around the prophetic giftings, the visionary gifting, the sight, the visions, and so on. Whereas in the newer Pentecostal church, it was more around speaking in tongues and people being empowered in that sense. So there was that. Both of them had emphasis on healing. Again, the methodology is slightly different, in that sense. But again, both of them had that emphasis in that sense. And I think their teaching, again, brought different emphasis. The way the newer Pentecostal churches will talk about teaching or will do teaching was very different to the emphasis that. So, for example, the Aladora churches their preaching will center more on stories and bringing out the Bible, whereas the newer Pentecostal church will look at the Bible in a perhaps more exegetical way, maybe going through verse by verse, uh, chapter by chapter, whereas the Aladora will look at stories, Old Testament stories, more perhaps than the New Testament. So there were some of these differences that I could say, looking back, they were there in that sense.
And would you say you're leading more towards Pentecostalism versus the African Indigenous
I think
churches?
where I am today, because even at the moment, I'm not my, the church I'm part of now is not actually not African Indigenous or Pentecostal. I'm actually in an English Baptist. I'm part of the English Baptist. So I've sort of moved around different church traditions. Hence, I work ecumenically, working with different churches. But one of the things I would say is this: even being among English Baptists, I say to people that I'm a Bapticostal because I've brought in my Pentecostal spirituality into my Baptist understanding of things, into Baptist ecclesiology or into Baptist theology in that sense. So I've sort of said the Pentecostal influence is there with me, but the African indigenous church background is also with me. So both shaped my spirituality. I use both in many of my works today in terms of writing, spirituality. So the attitude of prayer and fasting, again, is something common to both, whether African Pentecostal or African Indigenous Church. And again, that's a spirituality I've embraced. Watch night services is something I continue to engage in. Again, that has come from both in that sense. So they continue with me in that sense.
Okay, and fast forward. So you had this encounter, and then you migrated from Nigeria to the UK on a missionary basis.
Yes, I came to the UK as a missionary in 2004 because my Pentecostal church wanted to found or plant a church here in the UK. So I decided to come. Well, not decided. Basically, I was asked to come and help plant a church here in the UK. So I came as a result of that. But also, uh, I came because I wanted to continue my theological education, to study further my theological training because I did my first degree in Nigeria. So I wanted to continue my master's here. So I came as a missionary. And so I see myself as a reverse missionary today, in that sense. That is someone who's come from a previous mission field to now engaging in mission.
That has always baffled me, right? There seems to be a circle that is happening here, where you have the missionaries, like you just mentioned, you called it reverse missionary, where the missionaries from the UK and Western world would go into Africa, and now it seems like there is a need for missionaries from Africa to come to the Western world and plant churches and teach about Christ. Was it was it a shock for you in doing that, coming back this way and seeing that, oh, actually, these are the people that brought, or we say brought, but these
Sure.
are the people that
Yeah,
came over
preached it
with
before.
the biblical teachings and all of that, and now we're bringing it back to them. Was that a culture shock for you?
Yeah, I think for many of us who came to the UK, there is always that expectation that Britain is a Christian country or has a heritage of Christianity. But as you come into the country, you realize that that is no longer the case. that things have changed. Yeah, while there's still some semblance of Christianity, I think you can't really say categorically that it's still a Christian country because, again, so many things have changed. Doesn't mean there are not Christians in the UK. Of course, there are lots of Christians in the UK, but it just simply means that whilst Christianity used to shape societal values in several ways, that is no longer the case at the moment because things have changed. Uh, you know, people don't necessarily believe Christianity is for them. People don't believe in God at all. So a lot of people are either atheists, agnostics, or following other faith or no faith at all. So coming into that context from Nigeria, where religion permeates almost everything that you do, is always going to be a shock. I remember going back to Nigeria, going back to my church, Pentecostal church, and telling someone that there's a lot of people that don't believe in God in the UK. And this lady was just so shocked and said, how can people survive without believing in God? I'm like, well, a lot of people do actually. But, but she was just so shocked and surprised that there are people in the UK who don't believe in God. But, so there's always that shock. But I think after a while, you kind of get used to it. And then you realize that actually, maybe God has brought you here to help to remind people that actually there's a God that does exist and is interested in you and I, is interested in humanity. And then mission flows from that vantage point in that sense. So, but yeah, it's a privilege to be a missionary in the UK context.
Yeah, I wanted to emphasize on the example that you gave and the woman's response, that how do people survive? Do you think that is, or what's your opinion on that response? Because it's not a response that you would usually have in the Western world. Or how do people survive, you know?
No, it's not because I think here people are very independent of God, whereas for many Africans we are dependent on God. So it's a different worldview. I think the African worldview is very religious. It's deeply religious that you can't separate life itself from religion or religious practices. Whereas the Western world, interestingly, UK used to be like that before, but something shifted during the Enlightenment period where people became independent of religion, people became independent of God. The Enlightenment period brought in basically God was deposed and reason was imposed, as it were. So human beings were seen as the ultimate, that we can do things ourselves, we don't need God. And that is the basis for a secular society. Now we talked about secular society where religion is seen as marginal, it's private in that sense. So the response of the lady from Nigeria was not surprised to me, but it's not a response you will get in the UK Western context because it's just not the way people wired or the way the worldview is. The worldview is very different in that sense because people don't necessarily see God as integral to their day-to-day living or existence. Although, as I said at the start, there is a search for identity. And part of that now means people are searching for spirituality. People are searching for something in that sense. So yeah, I think that is where we are now. But
Yeah.
worldview is very different.
And would you say that was the biggest shock for you, migrating to the UK and doing the missionary work that you were doing, is to see how the worldview is so different in the UK? And what was it like, someone from Nigeria, for example, coming into the UK, looking to bring your understanding of the African Indigenous church and understanding of Pentecostal within the African continent, and bringing that to the United Kingdom? Because we see a lot of churches that they call black churches or African churches, even in the United Kingdom, and they sometimes face a lot of issue, should I say, challenges, um, you know, especially when it comes to, because what we all want to see in heaven, just like heaven says it would be everyone of all race, everyone of all region of the world coming together worshiping one God. And sometimes it can be difficult to have an interracial church, for example. depending on who the leader is. So what was it like coming from your background to this part of the world and saying and trying to plant a church?
Yeah, I think it was a learning curve for me in several ways, because I was coming into a different context and was coming into a multicultural society and learning the dynamics of multicultural churches. So the first church I was part of was very mixed, back in Lewisham, in London, was very mixed. So it was a place I learned a lot and relearn some of the things that I thought I knew, and I had to relearn certain things that if I were going to function in the UK context, there are some things that I brought from Nigeria that are important, but there are equally some things that will not be applicable here, in that sense. So I think,
Like what?
so for example, I think one of the things I quickly learned was that the way we evangelize in Nigeria is not going to be the same way we do evangelism here in the UK. Whilst in Nigeria, I could preach to people on the public transport, I could preach to people in the market square. Coming to the UK, I quickly observed that those kind of approaches, why I see people doing it and I understand, I think sometimes people people don't listen because they think you're disturbing their peace. And so it's a very different culture. Whereas in Nigeria, preaching on the public transport, on the public transport, on the market square or in the marketplace, people will listen because they respect you. They see you as a man of God. Whereas here, they're like, you're disturbing me, you're shouting at me. It's very different. That why are you shouting? Why do you have to be aggressive preaching God's word in that sense? Like I remember observing one of the street preachers in Regent Street near, sort of in London, and realized as people were walking past, they were just wondering why this person was shouting. They were just they couldn't even hear what the person was saying properly. And what was even so sad for me on that day was that the message the person was preaching was more around people going to hell, which I understand. But the way it was just being communicated, one, people couldn't hear properly, and two, those who perhaps could even hear, they were not hearing something that would necessarily, it was more of a scary message in that sense. We're walking past this person, further down the line was another group of religious people, sick, who were offering people food. And people were coming to there and they were talking. Different approach by different religion, which people were engaging with because they were talking. Whereas the other approach of one of my African brothers was shouting and people couldn't hear. And the message itself was not one that I would necessarily want to preach, at least not in that context, in that sense. So I think you have to rethink how you do evangelism. You have to rethink how you do church. So again, one of the things I decided to do was I didn't want to lead a Nigerian church because I felt there were many of those already. So I decided I want to lead a multicultural church. I want to be in a multicultural space because London, Britain is multicultural. Hence, I've been involved in leading multicultural churches. And today I talk a lot about the need for people to develop intercultural churches that goes even further than multicultural churches, in that sense.
What's the difference for someone?
Well, the difference is multicultural churches is all about representation. It's all about different people. Intercultural church, yes, there's representation, but it goes further to ask the question. We have 46 different nationalities here. So what? What does that mean? How does that translate to how we do church? How does that translate to worship, to how we do worship? How does that shape our preaching? How does that shape uh, people who sit on the leadership team or the executive team or the council or who do Sunday school, who doesn't do Sunday school? How does that shape the life of the church? So it's not just about representation, it's about integration and engagement in that sense. So those are some of the key
Yeah, and
differences.
what you said you led a few different intercultural churches in the UK.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of leading two multicultural churches in London. I've led three churches, two more multicultural than the other, in that sense, but they became a very important learning point in my journey of working in unity and diversity and working with different
Yeah,
people.
I wanted to link that to a statement that you said to me, which was how difficult it is for a black man or a black pastor to lead a multicultural church. Do you want to explore more on that?
Yes, so it's easier for a white pastor to lead an intercultural church than a person of color or a black pastor. And the reason for that is because I think white leadership is generally accepted than a leadership of a person of color. Because I think in the Western world, people are still used to white leadership. That's what people know. That's what people see. Those are the people that are training us. Those are the people that are writing. So it shapes everything. So a person of color, uh, not that we can't lead intercultural churches. Of course, there are people of color leading intercultural churches, but sometimes the leadership is not easy to get to. One, put it this way, we've we've come a long way of being recognized as human in the first place, and then to be able to lead. Let's take Africa for example. For Africans to be able to lead other Africans on the continent during the mission period, it took a while. It took ages. And then now people coming back to the UK, those of us coming back to the UK, people see us more as economic migrants. And so there's still the challenge that how can economic migrants lead? How can they lead in the UK context? So their leadership is still on trial, is still on probation. Some will accept it readily than the others, but white leadership leading an intercultural church, I think, is more accepted than a person of color leading an intercultural church.
And you being one that has been able to lead a multicultural church, what were the biggest challenge for you as a leader, as a black leader in a multicultural church?
I think you have to adjust to a lot of things because you are operating not from you can't operate mainly from your culture, because the people you are leading have come from different places. So you need to create you need to create an environment where everyone feels appreciated, everyone feels loved. So what that means is you have to put your own culture to one side almost to be able to do that effectively. Not that you erase who you are totally, but it just simply means that you have to come to a place where everyone is compromising who they are to some extent to be able to create this new church, this new framework, this new structure, this new culture, to be able to do that. And not many people are able to do that, which is why I think there are not many African pastors who can lead an intercultural church because it's a lot of hard work. For me, it was a constant learning and readjustment, even till now. You are constantly learning about different people, about different culture, about different ways of doing different things. So it's tiring, it's exhausting, and doing it as a black person simply means that there are several things you are navigating in that sense, because the white members of your congregation, especially if they are used to white leadership, means that there are some things that you as a black pastor that you still bringing in is very different for them, and they are adjusting to that. Some will not adjust to that, some will probably actually leave, and so it's difficult. There is always the experience of white flight for black pastors, where if you are leading maybe a white majority church or a multicultural church with a lot of white people in it, sometimes when a person of color comes to leadership, sometimes the white congregation leaves quietly. Some will say, well, people are moving to other parts of UK. There is that, but sometimes there is still the challenge of white flight, where white congregants might leave gradually because they they haven't adjusted properly to that new leadership. And we see this happen. I've seen this happen in several places. So it's one of the challenges that we
Yeah,
face, I think.
and do you think it's a matter of time? You know, and I guess it's a two-part question. Do you think it's a matter of time where an African or a black pastor is more accepted? Like you talked about how, we are going through the stages now. It took a while for Black people to even be recognized as human beings. So we're getting through the stages now where it's fine to see a Black leader, and it's starting to be accepted. Do you think that's just a matter of time, or do you think it is, and possibly interlinked and related, a matter of adjustment in terms of, yes, the Black leader needs to adjust maybe his way of leadership, his tone of message, in order to both captivate people of African descent and white people as well, and also from the side of the congregation to understand that yes, it's different, but maybe there are some things that I need to be willing to accept or tolerate as we go forward.
I think, yeah, there will have to be adjustments on both sides. Yeah, there will have to be adjustments on people of color, as well as white British indigenes in that sense. There will have to be adjustments on both sides. But the question is, who is more inconvenienced? Who needs more adjustments? Who needs to make more sacrifice? I think that's one of the key questions in an intercultural church. In a multicultural church, some people sacrifice more than others. In an intercultural church, there should be a mutual sacrifice. We all should be sacrificing towards something, not one community more than the others. The burden should be shared. That's one of the key aspects of being in a multicultural, in an intercultural church, is that there should be that mutual sacrifice and inconveniencing going on, so that one community is not sacrificing more than the others. So
But what do you then say to, or where do we draw the divide where we talk about people who think that if you come to the UK, then you should accept the culture of the UK? It shouldn't be a sense of both parties have to sacrifice. No, you need to change and sacrifice to fit the context.
yeah, I understand that argument, because obviously we are in Britain, so I expect people to learn English and to be able to communicate in English because we are in the UK. I think definitely that makes sense to adjust to the culture here. I think that's important, because if you don't do that, then you won't be able to communicate with people around you, especially if you want to communicate the gospel. You won't be able to do that. So that's important to adjust to the culture here. But I think the other thing that is important is, I think because Britain has a colonial history, it makes it tricky. Say Britain didn't have a colonial history, then you can say, well, people should just fully adjust and that's it. But because I think of that colonial history, it simply means that when people come, they come with a kind of a baggage and a questioning, or especially when they get here, that questions becomes more amplified, because you realize that, yes, Britain colonized us and those power dynamics is at play. So I think that is where the other adjustment is needed, because of that history of colonization. Then I think people here need to adjust. At this part of that adjustment is understanding that colonial history, and then to impact how we behave today in that sense. So I think that's just very important. Yeah.
Okay. Because of time, I'm gonna switch quickly to you. You also mentioned that it was difficult adjusting. And forgive me if I'm not getting it correctly, but you did marry interracially,
Oh,
and
yes,
and
yes.
you mentioned that something about that being one of the challenges. Um, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so I'm in an intercultural marriage. My wife is English. I will actually say, if there's anything that has prepared and helped me to engage in intercultural, multicultural churches, basically put it this way, it's something that I live. Uh, so I've got that practical experience of working because of my marriage and my children, but it also helped me to be able to navigate a multicultural church and context. So basically, I live and breathe interculturality. My marriage is intercultural. The ministry I'm engaging is intercultural. Everything that I've been involved in is very intercultural. So actually, I will argue that my marriage prepares me to be engaged, to be able to engage better in intercultural church and ministry in that sense. So we've been married for 18 years and we've got two children. And my wife is also in ministry. She works for London City Mission. I work for Evangelical Alliance, amongst other things. So we're both in ministry, and in that sense, and so yeah, I think our marriage reflects the kind of ministry we are both involved in that sense.
Do you ever, this is just a very curious one. Do you ever just sit with your wife and, you know, try and think, okay, brainstorm, how can we do better to brood intercultural churches, in the United Kingdom and all over the world? Like, what can we do, and what are some of the things that you maybe came up with? And I'm asking this
Sure.
with somebody in mind that perhaps wants that same thing. We want. I don't think there's anybody. Well, I don't think there are many people that do not want an intercultural church. But the truth about it is that it is challenging,
It
especially
is.
like you
Yeah,
have
it
said, if
is.
you're coming from a black pastor, a black leader.
Yeah.
How would you then advise somebody like that to be able to achieve that goal? What would you say the person should maybe think about, or the person needs to do in terms of how they approach it?
I think to be able to develop an intercultural church, you have to develop lots of competencies. You have to, self awareness is very key. Intentionality is very key. Put it this way, you cannot pray and then develop an intercultural church. Prayer is fantastic, it's great, and I believe in prayer, but if just by praying you think you will develop an intercultural church, it's never going to happen. You have to put certain things in place, certain steps. You have to be ready to sacrifice. You have to be intentional. As I said, intentionality means that you are ready to compromise certain things. You are ready to, it's not just an accident. It won't just happen. You have to be proactive. Just like I was proactive not to start a Nigerian church, but to go into an English church. That is intentionality. That is being proactive. And I think, going back to my wife again, we talked about, some of the challenges that people face or we face in developing multicultural and intercultural ministry. Racism is a big barrier. And it's one that if we're going to develop again an intercultural church, we have to be ready to talk about racism. Sometimes most churches don't want to talk about it because it's a difficult subject, but you have to be able to talk about it. Because if you don't, then certain things will not be aired and then healed or reconciled. To begin the process of reconciliation, you have to address the problem. You have to ask the question, what's the diagnosis? What's the problem? And if, you know, uh, you know, racism happens in society and it also happens in some of our churches, unfortunately. And so we have to address that if we're going to develop an intercultural church. We cannot ignore it, or we cannot call it something else or ignore it. It just won't happen. So that's something that myself and my wife, we talked about. How racism dehumanizes people. And it's something that, again, we see in churches, and it's something that is important to
But
address.
but how do you address it?
You have to talk about it in house groups. You have to preach about it. It's one of the reasons why at Evangelical Alliance we've developed a resource around racial justice, looking at Bible study, like a Bible study resource on racial justice. It's called Visions of Justice and Hope. And again, the reason why we developed that is to help churches to be able to talk about it, because we know churches struggle to talk about it. And so Visions of Justice and Hope is to help people to be able to talk about racial justice in their churches. So it's a Bible study tool that people can use in house groups, or you can use in your, through your preaching series or something like that. So it's helpful. So yeah, because we have to broach that subject.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Israel. It's been a privilege, and it's been exciting hearing about you and really the things that you're passionate about. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.